And at the very end, we see you won the game when I get to the statue. Now at this point, we have all the knowledge needed to create this beautiful castle environment you see right here. In this last chapter, I will walk through the entire process. We will start off by sculpting and painting the landscape, and then we will move on to creating the castle using modular assets. Finally, we'll paint trees and foliage, and at the end, add a third-person character to our world so the player can walk around our finished environment. While you can follow this tutorial exactly, I highly encourage you to experiment and create your own unique environment. Use this video as a reference and veer off the path to make this world your own. Since after all, you are not creating my environment, you're creating your own one. But before we can do that, a quick word from our sponsor. Just kidding, we don't have a sponsor, but if you do want to support the channel, then you could check out the Unreal Masterclass. The Masterclass is an expanding collection of exclusive tutorials and lessons for Unreal Engine 5. In it, we take an even deeper dive into Unreal, going over animation, architectural visualization, advanced blueprints, how to create a game completely from scratch, and much more. Another way to support this channel is by subscribing and sharing this video, because I have a lot more free tutorials and assets planned for the future. So with all that being said, let's create our castle. Okay, before we get started, of course we need to create a brand new project, since I want to show the process completely from scratch, which means we start off with a new project. So double click to open up Unreal Engine, and in the project browser, let's select games. And for a template, I'm going to select third person. So third person will have a bunch of assets already loaded up in our project. The reason why is because I want to use the mannequin right here as a human reference to help us with scale and to make sure that our environment isn't too big or too small. Now for project location, that's correct. I just want to save this onto my desktop. And for the name, let's call this one Castle Environment. Now, I don't need the starter content and I don't need ray tracing, so let's press create. The reason why is because we already have some content we're going to use in the starter assets we downloaded. So if you haven't downloaded the assets already, there's a link in the description below. This is what you will see in a brand new project with a third person template. Down here it says new plugins are available. We can dismiss that and select update. So this is a very simple map. If I press play, we automatically spawn in as our character. Reminder to move around, it's the WASD keys, and you can press space to jump. So pretty simple. Now I don't want to use a third person template map right here. I want to create a new map completely from scratch. So we're not going to go to file and select new level and then use a template. Instead, I'm going to create a map through the content browser. So right click on content and create a brand new folder. Call this folder maps. And within here, right click, new level. And this one will be, as you could probably guess, Castle Environment. So double click to go inside of here. And now we're inside a completely blank Unreal level. So before we do anything, let's create a landscape. Come up to select landscape, and it's going to automatically use the new tool. I'm going to keep everything as default and press create. Now we can't see the landscape because we need to add in a directional light. Go to lights, directional light, drag it in. And now we need a sky. So let's go to visual effects, sky and atmosphere, drag that in. And add in a cube. So let's add in a cube right there. And I think right now is a good time to bring in a human reference. I like to bring in a human reference as soon as possible to make sure everything is scaled correctly. So go into characters, mannequins, meshes, and we can drag in any of these. I'm going to drag in skm_Manny for our human reference. Now, if we zoom in on the shadows, obviously we need a little bit of a bluish tint from our sky, and that is where the skylight will come in. So hopefully by now, if you have watched the tutorial, then you are pretty familiar with this lighting setup. So select the skylight, and because we're using a sky and atmosphere, I want the skylight to have real-time capture turn on and set to movable, and have our directional light also be set to movable. And congratulations, you are basically done with lighting an outdoor scene. There is one last step we can do, and that is to get rid of this black void that's in the bottom half of my world. We're going to hide that. by adding in exponential height fog, like that. So lighting in Unreal Engine has pretty much never been easier. Another thing I'm going to do to prevent my camera from getting brighter and darker is to, of course, add in a post-process volume. So go to volumes, post-process volume, add that in, go to exposure, and we're going to set that to manual. It's not making effect right now because if I go into my post-process volume, it affects my camera, but if I go out, it doesn't. So I need to make sure that my post-process volume has infinite extent unbound turned on, and with exposure compensation, bring this up from 1 to 11. Or we can even leave it at 10.5 for now, but we will be changing the exposure compensation throughout the rest of this video, since I think it's very helpful to see what our world looks like using different post-process settings. And one last thing we could do that I personally like to add to all my worlds, but it's entirely up to you, is to add in clouds. So come to add, visual effects, and drag in volumetric clouds just like that. And at this point, we are pretty much done with the lighting portion. I'd say about 80% of outdoor scenes are simply lit this way. So you have your sunlight, skylight, and exponential height fog. Of course, you need your skylight. That's how we get our blue sky. And maybe, optionally, we get clouds. So with all of that, you're able to quickly light an outdoor scene very easily. And a post-process volume, which we will be controlling our exposure compensation. Now, as a reminder, you can move the directional light by clicking on it and rotating it around, or as a shortcut, you can hold down Control and L to rotate it that way. So by no means is the lighting of our world final. We're going to continually jump back to these actors and change their properties to see what settings and options look nice. I think it's time now to handle the landscape, since obviously landscapes won't look like this. There'll be grass, dirt, cliffs, and so on. So we can get a nice landscape material I've already created from the downloadable asset pack. So let's move this to the side. And here is the downloadable content. So make sure you do download this because you will need the assets to follow along with the rest of the tutorial. So double click to open it up, go intro Unreal 5, and it's the castle assets. So I'm going to drag it onto my desktop to unzip it. This folder is an Unreal project that contains all the assets I want to use. So of course we need to migrate those assets into my main project. So let's open up castle asset. And here we have some assets we're going to use to create our castles. So of course we have all of our castle static meshes. We even have some mountain meshes that we're going to place in the background. But we're not going to go over these static meshes just yet, since what I want to use is the landscape material. So jump into castle assets, landscapes, and it's m_landscape instance. So let's migrate all these assets into our main project. So press Control Space and right click on castle assets, select migrate, and make sure everything is selected. So everything's looking correct, and then select OK. Now it's going to ask for a destination folder. We can find the destination folder by manually going to our desktop and into our project's content folder, or I can press Control Space in our main project, right click on content, go to show and explore, and then copy the location of the content folder and paste its location right there like that and select it. So all these assets have been copied over to castle environment. Now we no longer need this project. I can exit out, and in castle assets, we have everything. So jump into maps, overview, and here was that exact map we were just on, but now it's in our main project. Also, whenever we exit out of our project and open it back up, let's go into maps, our main environment right here, castle environment, to be the map that's opened. So to help us save time so we don't always have to navigate to castle environment to open it up, I could go to project settings, and within maps and modes, under editor startup map, select castle environment. So now whenever we open up our project, our main map will be the one that's opened. So let's jump back into castle environment and add m_landscape instance to our landscape. Now I can't just drag it onto our landscape. Instead, I'm going to select the landscape and make sure landscape material slot is visible right there. And then drag m_landscape instance onto it like that. Now our landscape is completely black, but that's expected. Jump into landscape mode and select paint. And I want to assign auto material to my entire landscape. So click on the plus icon and select weight blended layer normal. Now it's going to create a landscape layer. We can save it at the default folder that they have. Click save and save everything. So now we have grass on our landscape. And what's neat about this material is that if we start sculpting, we can see that as I sculpt, our materials naturally transition. So we go from grass at the top to cliff at very sharp angles and then back to grass. So it just adds an extra layer of realism. This material is very similar to the auto material that you can see on my channel. I have an entire video that takes a deep dive into all the settings of this material, but really quickly I'm going to go over them. That's so you know exactly how to use this material. So let's go open up this material instance, and we can see that we have just a bunch of different settings. So I'm going to undock the details panel to make it easier for us and move it off to the right side. Now to begin, you'll notice that a lot of these parameters are actually repeating. That's because each of these different materials, so D_materials, C, B, and A, all share basically the exact same parameters, which control the look of specific layers. So A material is the grass layer, B is the cliff, C is mud, and D is basically dry soil, which we're going to use as a trail, and E is something customizable, where if you really want, let's say, snow, then you could go into bridge and then plug those textures up right here. We're not just limited to the auto material. We can manually paint in grass or cliff wherever we want. So jumping back to landscape mode, paint. Let's say maybe I don't want a cliff right here, then I could paint in grass. So let me create weight blended layer normals for all the material layers right here. Up to D, since we don't need E and no height map, and then select A. So I can paint away the cliff right there, then manually tell Unreal where I want my cliff and grass textures. I can also go in with mud, and we're going to use this when we add water into my landscape in just a bit. Also, we have material D, which we're going to use as a trail. So again, this material is insanely customizable. So if you don't like these textures, or you want a new material, then you could go in and edit them. So let's begin with what albedo controls do. So albedo controls function the exact same way that they do for our Quixel Bridge assets. So we could boost the saturation up and make the landscape grass really saturated. Or we can boost the brightness or decrease the brightness right there. We can also increase and decrease the contrast of the texture. Below that is tint. It's just to give a different colored overlay. So if I want to make my grass a little bit reddish, I can add the tint right there. And then we have normal strength. Of course, this controls the normal map. So let me find a good angle, increase it. I have a much more intense normals, so there's more depth and shadows, or decrease it, and we have no shadows. So I'm just going to leave it at its default of 1. That roughness, as you can guess, controls how rough the landscape is. And then spec strength controls the specularity. Now, generally, I like to keep this really low, because if we do have a very specular landscape, for example, let's make this 3, then our landscape looks more like plastic than something you would stand on. So we'll leave that at 0.1. And then we have distance blending. So right now, maybe you can see it, but when we're up close to the landscape, we have a certain tiling amount. So this is what the size looks like when the camera's up close to it. But if we go away, then we transition to a lot less tiling where the texture size is a lot larger. So zooming in, we get smaller, and far away it's a lot larger. That is just one method we're going to use to hide the texture repetition. And we can turn it on and off right here. So here is what it looks like with distance blending turned on. And then here's what it looks like without distance blending. So this is with and without. So distance blending is a great way to hide texture repetition. And we have mask. So mask, if I turn that on, basically switches out our texture right here. So if I have this unchecked, then we're using a roughness. Or if I want to use a mask texture, then I'm going to select it right there. But since all my textures are just using roughness, I'm going to have that unchecked. And then we have size and size far. So size far, as you can guess, controls the tiling for the faraway map. And size A controls the tiling for something up close, like right here. And we have start offset and blend fall off, which control where the distance blending starts. So maybe you want the distance blending to start a lot closer up to the camera. Then we could change start offset from 3800 to 380 centimeters. So now it's a lot closer, but I'm going to leave that where it's pretty far away. And these same parameters function exactly alike for the rest of my material. So B material, C material, and D material. Although B material does have something a little bit different, and that is down here, we have B underscore material triplanar. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to create a very steep slope. Go to flatten, increase the brush right there, and create a steep slope. Also maybe add just a little bit of smoothing to smooth it out. I'm going to press Alt and 3 to go into unlit mode. And here is what our cliff looks like with triplanar. And here's what it looks like without triplanar. So especially right here, our texture is very stretched. But then if we add triplanar, then the texture is fixed and it looks normal. So that's why we're using triplanar on B material, because odds are it's this material right here that's going to be on really sharp edges since it's the cliff material. So hopefully with all that knowledge, you're able to control and create your landscape exactly the way that you want. Again, on my channel, there's an entire video that takes a deeper dive into all these settings. So I'm going to exit out of my material instance and paint our first pass on our landscape. So the way I recommend that you create environments is that you first handle the really large detail first. For example, your landscapes and your mountains. And then once you get the correct form down, then you can move on to your medium detail, which is the trees and the castle. And finally, when you like how those look, move down to the really, really small detail, like your grass, pebbles, and shrubs. That's the best way to create large environments in Unreal, because let's say, for example, you spend a lot of time sculpting a mountain, and then you also spend a lot of time adding meshes, trees, houses to that mountain, but then you decide that you don't like the fundamental way that the mountain looks, then you're going to have to go all the way back to the beginning, which is sculpting it. So it's best to make sure that you like your environment before adding in small details. So let's go to sculpt and increase the brush size with the right bracket key until it's pretty large. And what I'm going to do is go around the perimeter of my landscape and then just add in random hills. So some perimeters like this, hills. And this is a reminder, you're not limited to the current size of your landscape. So if you want to increase the size, then go to manage and select add. Now I can click or hold down the left mouse button to add on new components to make my landscape even bigger. Before we continue sculpting our landscape, it's very essential that we first go over bookmarks. Because when creating our environments, I recommend that you have one central location. So one point that you're always referencing back to look at your environment. That's how you're able to keep track of all the changes you made. And this is basically going to be our main cinematic shot. So I think right here is a good spot for our main shot, our main camera location. But now there's an issue, that is whenever I do make an edit, I have to fly all the way over there and then try to eyeball where my camera was originally. And this is where bookmarks come in really handy. So first you want to find a spot that you like, then come up here and click on the 3-line button, and all the way down here under bookmarks, go to set bookmark, and I'm going to set this as bookmark 1. Also the shortcut is wherever you are in your environment, press Control and 1. Now I can fly around anywhere, and then press the 1 key on my keyboard to snap to that original location. So that's Control and 1 to set a bookmark, and then it's 1 to snap to that bookmark's location. And we're not just limited to one bookmark. We have 10 different bookmarks. So for example, I could do Control 2 right here, and all the way over here, I have Control and 3. So now 1, 2, and 3 keys will then snap to the different bookmark locations. And if I ever want to override a bookmark, for example, I don't like the angle or the location of 2, then I can find a new location, press Control 2, and now we have the new bookmark. So let's click on 1, and this is going to be my main shot right here. So press Control and 1 to set that bookmark. So what I want to do is jump back into landscape, sculpt, and on the right side of my main cinematic shot, I want a really tall mountain, which will essentially be where our main castle is located. And then to the left of that will be a little bit smaller hillside where some castle ruins will be located. So go to flatten and decrease the brush size. Move this out. Then go to smooth and smooth all of this out. So same thing right here. Go into flatten this entire location and make this terrace just a little bit taller. Also, give it a sharper slope with the flatten, and that's too sharp, so then smooth it out with the smooth brush. So the vast majority of sculpting in Unreal Engine is alternating between the sculpt brush, smooth brush, and the flatten brush. So that's pretty much all we're going to be doing when sculpting in Unreal. So let's press 1 again, and I'm actually going to angle it. Let's go right here and press Control and 1. So behind me, I'm also going to elevate right here. And I'm going to get rid of this example sculpt. So go to flatten brush and flatten all of that out. Also, go into paint, auto material, and paint over those paint layers. Because I was just using that as an example. So I want several hillsides. So we have one layer of hills in the back, and then another layer of hills all the way back here to just add depth to my environment. That's how our environment looks like. It's a lot larger than just right here. And another thing I'm going to do is to handle the really, really large details is to go into Castle Assets, Meshes, and drag out these meshes right here, which are our mountains. So by default, I think the mountains are way too large. So the details panel, I'm going to decrease it by 0.5. So I need to type 0.5 in X, 0.5 in Y, and then 0.5 again in Z, or a shortcut. I'm going to press Control and Z to undo all that, is to select this lock icon. So now whenever I make a change in the X, Y, or Z axis, the change is going to be shared between them. So now if I press 0.5, they all get 0.5. So that's a nice shortcut. Let's go move all of them right here. Bring this down. And try to find some good angles for these meshes. So these are just background meshes. Of course, the player would probably never be on top of the mountains. It's just a good way to add scale to the environment without actually creating an entirely new landscape and then going through and having to sculpt that landscape. Keep in mind that at some points when creating this environment, I'll speed up the video because honestly, there will be a lot of repetition, since the majority of creating an environment is just sculpting the landscape, painting foliage, and moving objects around. And notice how I'm continually pressing 1 and jumping back to my main shot to see how the mountainscape looks. And I think, hold on, Alt again, move that right there, And I think our mountains are looking pretty nice. And now it's also a good time to change some of the settings on the exponential height fog, since I think our world is a little bit too foggy to begin with. So if you remember, I'm going to select the exponential height fog. If you can't find where it is in our world, then within the outliner, type in exponential, and then it will show up right here. If I grab the exponential height fog and move it up, we move the fog up, or if I move it down, it goes down. So we're able to control where the fog starts by playing with that object. And for fog height fall off, I'm going to increase that to 0.3. Fog density, also slightly decrease that. And move that down. I don't like the angle of my sun, so hold down Control and L and rotate it. That's how the shadows are coming across the screen. So we're going from left to right, like here. And another thing I noticed is that it's pretty hard to see how big this hill is. So I'm going to add a character to make sure the scale is correct. So skm_Manny. And this is way too small. I thought it was a lot bigger. So jump into landscape mode again. Let's sculpt this up a little bit. And I think we're almost there. Flatten it. Give it a sharper edge. Decrease the brush. And also flatten it over here. Let's see what our main shot looks like. And I'm going to change the angle a little bit. Also, bring down my camera speed. That's us more up. And press Control and 1. So I think this looks good for now. Now let's create a lake. So we're going to create a little bit of a lake right here. And a river that goes in between these two hills that make a little valley. So we're going to sculpt. And hold down Shift to decrease the space right here. So we carve out an area for our lake right there. And I'm actually going to flatten out this entire area over here too. Going to smooth all that out. And now for this location, let's add in the water by going to Castle Assets, Meshes, and it is SM_water plane. So simply drag that out and increase the size to get a lake. So very simple to get water. Now I know that Unreal Engine 5 technically does have water built in, but as of this Unreal Engine version, which is the first version of UE5, the official water plugin is in beta and it is pretty glitchy. So instead we're going to use the traditional way of creating water, and that is with a simple flat plane that's using a water material. Also, if you don't like the way the water looks, you can open up its material instance and change some of the settings. So I'm going to undock the details panel. That's so I can briefly go over what some of these parameters do. So first off, of course, we have deep water and shore color. So shore color is going to change the color of the shore, and then deep water is going to change the main color. So maybe you want two different colors for the shore and the deep water. Right here we have opacity, and this controls how opaque the water is. So notice how when I do decrease it, our water is much more faint. And then notice how we have a little bit of ripples, and these ripples are being driven by the normal map that's right here. So maybe you don't like the ripples, you want to get rid of them. Then you could go into ripple normal intensity and bring that from 0.5 to 0. So now we have perfectly still water, but I do like a little bit of ripples in there. So I'm going to leave it at 0.5. We can also control how large the ripples are with ripple tiles. So right now it's set to 900, set to 100 for really, really small ripples, or set that to something even larger for basically waves. But I think the value that I left it right here is pretty good. We could even control how chaotic the ripples are, since right now they're pretty slow. I want them to be slow because I want this scene to be pretty peaceful, but you can increase the speed to 1, Now it is very fast. Personally, I'm not going to change anything because I like the settings as they are right now. So just know that you do have the options to change the way your water looks if you don't like it. We need to make some edits to our landscape right now because our water isn't making that much sense. Our grass is growing underneath the water when it should be muddy. Let's go into landscape paint and finally use the mud layer right there. So where there's water, I'm going to paint in mud to help the transition in between the grass and the water. Also, use the flatten brush and sculpt, decrease my brush size with the left bracket key, and I'm going to paint a river in between the two hills. So hold on the left mouse button and paint it like that. The plane isn't big enough, so let's increase that size. And also go into landscape mode, increase the size of my brush. That's so I can make the lake bigger and even longer like that. Let's make room for the lake over here. Smooth it out. Decrease the brush size of the flatten brush. And create another river. We have a river going into a lake. And then it continues down that way. So increase that size. And then smooth it all out right here on the sides. At this point, I'm fast forwarding just a little bit since all I'm doing is sculpting and painting layers. So I'm making sure that I'm painting mud wherever there's water, and I'm also smoothing out the shoreline. So there isn't as harsh of a transition in between the water and the landscape. I'm also moving this hill a little further back to make more room for the valley, and smoothing out my hills so we don't have as sharp of a 90-degree angle on the landscapes, and to keep everything smooth. And since we have made a lot of progress, maybe in the future I might make a really large change, and I don't like that change, so I want to come back to this state of our level. Something I like to do with my environments is press Control and Space. Let's go find out where this map is. Here we have our map, Castle Environment, same map that we currently have open up here, Castle Environment. Let's save everything. And then select Castle Environment, press Control C and Control V to duplicate that. And I'm going to call this one Castle Backup 01. So whenever I make large changes, I like to duplicate the map I'm currently editing just to create a backup. In case I make some really big error, I can always go back to a previous version of this level. So far, I like my large details. The landscape looks good for now, and the mountains look great, so does the river, but there is one last large detail we need to add, and that is some mini mountains or some more hills. That's how the transition in between the sculpted landscape and the mountain isn't as harsh, since there is no mesh in between our main space and the background mountains. So we're going to do this with a very specific Megascan asset that I like. So let's come to Add, Quixel Bridge. There's only one asset I want to download right now, and that's under 3D Assets. And type in Icelandic Volcano. And click Enter. So it's specifically this one right here. So Icelandic Volcano Terrain. And this is one of my favorite meshes because I think it's very versatile since it's huge. It's large. It can be used as mountains, hills, just large terrain in general. It adds a lot of detail to the background. So we could download medium quality, but since this mesh is going to be very large, I'm going to download this as nanite quality. So do keep in mind that if you are going to download this as nanite, the textures are going to be 8K and there will be a lot of polys. So it's going to take up a lot of space in your project. But since it's already downloaded for me, I'm going to select the Add button. And now this mesh, if I double click on it to open it up, here we have the Icelandic Volcano Terrain. So let's exit out of both of these. Press Control and Space. Go to Megascans, 3D assets, volcano terrain, and drag it out. Now I'm going to scale it up. That's how it's pretty large, and move it off to the side. So let me go scale this up even again and move it. That's how it's somewhere like right there. Just like that. And maybe even scale it down. So let me copy and paste multiple of these just with different sizes within the middle right here, so that we have even more background meshes to help blend in between our landscape and mountains. So this is why I really like this mesh, is because there's so much detail on it that you're able to copy and paste it multiple times and use it just like how I am using it right here. Also, I think it's a little bit too dark, so let's open up the material instance right here, grab the details panel, and for albedo tint, make it a little bit more green. That's how it blends in with the landscape. And then increase the saturation just a little bit. And right here is the time lapse for the finishing touches of our large detail. So this is everything I did before we moved on to the medium detail, which will be our trees and the actual castle. All I'm doing right now is copying and pasting, moving the same assets we've been using, which are the mountains and the volcanic terrain, around my entire landscape. That's how from all angles, we are surrounded by mountains. So it really feels like that our castle is in the middle of the Alps or somewhere mountainous like that. Now that I'm done with the mountains, I'm going through my landscape and adding some finishing touches, just trying to make my landscape flow a lot more natural by going through with the smooth brush and removing a lot of the sharp edges. Don't forget to compare your landscape to the human reference, since we don't have any buildings or trees to give us a visual representation of the size of our sculpts. Right now I'm adding more hills and variation just to randomize my terrain and make it more realistic. Also, just because we're done with the large detail doesn't mean we're done sculpting. If you do want to make a change, and this is great about Unreal Engine, even if you added a bunch of meshes, you can still sculpt your terrain again and just move the meshes around to make sure that they're on top of the terrain. So just because we're done with large details doesn't mean we're done sculpting. Now it's on to the medium to large detail, specifically cliff meshes. Because right now our cliffs look pretty plain. It's just a little bit of a slope with a plain texture that's repeating. So it's not very visually pleasing and it doesn't really feel like cliffs. And we can fix this by replacing the landscape with static meshes. So we're going to overlay static meshes, which will represent our cliffs. To do so, of course, you could probably guess where we're going to get these meshes, and that is Quixel Bridge. Static meshes I want to use are called Nordic Cliff. So press enter, and it's these really large ones all the way down here. So these meshes we're going to use to represent our cliffs. Now I've already gone ahead and I favorited a lot of the meshes right here. So just go through, find some of the static meshes that you like, download them, and import them. Now it's important to know that I decided to download all of these static meshes at high quality, which is not nanite quality. So it doesn't have the detail of nanite. It's also in 4K and not in 8K. The reason why I decided to use high quality is simply put memory space. Because if we were to use nanite, then very quickly your project can balloon to over 50 gigabytes large. And I just want to keep my project pretty lightweight. But if you do want the best quality possible, and that is nanite, then nothing's stopping you from using nanite except memory space. So I've already gone ahead and I downloaded a lot of these objects. I'm just going to go through and add all the large cliff meshes. So we're not adding foliage and small rocks just yet. I'm only adding the very large cliffs to my project. And now that I've added all of these cliffs, we can see that we have a lot of new folders under Megascan's 3D assets. As a reminder, if you want to filter for a specific object or asset type within a folder structure, you want to select the folder and click on this button right here. And let's filter for static meshes. So we can see all the meshes we're about to use. I'm going to exit bridge. Whenever I download a lot of assets, I like to fly off to the side of my world and drag them out just so that I see exactly what meshes we have access to. So go to Megascan's 3D assets and let's filter for the static meshes to see all of them and drag them out into my world. So we have this really large one. I'm going to move to the side and scale down. That's a little bit too large. And we have a bunch of other glyph static meshes. Now, just because these aren't nanite meshes doesn't mean we can't use nanite. And I recommend for your majority of meshes, if you are able to use nanite, since it gives us more detail and it's just much more performant than using traditional levels of detail. So select all of them, right click, and let's enable nanites like that, and press Ctrl S to save. So now that I see all the different meshes I have, what I'm going to do is select the large ones, hold down Alt, and duplicate them over here to start placing them on my cliff. So we have this one right here that I can scale up and simply place it. That's how it's hovering over the cliff like that. Essentially what I'm doing right now is that I'm combining all the different cliff meshes. That's how it makes it look like they're all one cliff mesh and that it's part of the landscape. Do keep in mind that when I'm placing my static meshes, we want to look out for the bottoms of the static meshes. For example, right here, since when they did scan in these objects, it took a little bit of the bottom with them. So, for example, right here, we can see that the bottom of the static mesh, which is the mesh's ground floor, is showing. So I can hide that by just increasing the elevation of the landscape a little bit, like that. And also, to hide the ground floor for this mesh, I can scale it in the y-axis a little bit. And position the mesh, that's how the cliff that's at the bottom is covering the static mesh's holes. Fortunately, the bottom cliff mesh isn't big enough to cover the holes. Here's an example of what I mean. Obviously, this is very unnatural. Cliffs don't do this in real life. So this is why we downloaded the boulders over here. So hold down Alt, and let's duplicate all of them. Move them over to my cliff area. And with the boulder selected, I can smash them into the wall right here to hide the holes in my cliff. Now I'm repeating the exact same process, but for the rest of the cliff. So wherever there's a slope, I'm going to add the static mesh to that area. Also, keep in mind that because all our meshes are nanite, we pretty much have infinite detail. So that means you can copy and paste as many of these cliffs as you want, without having to worry about performance. Also, of course, the landscape isn't perfectly deforming to the static meshes, so we have to go into landscape editing mode and make some adjustments. Specifically, I'm going to make heavy use of the flatten brush, just to flatten the landscape area so the landscape isn't going above the cliffs, since I want there to be cliffs and then flat landscape after that. Now I'm going to do the same exact process, but for the smaller cliffs to the left of my river. So copy and paste some of the static meshes we've already added to our world and place them onto the smaller ones. Now, do keep in mind that I'm not going over the entire cliff, specifically the back area. I'm only filling in the areas that are seen in my main shot. If you want, you can also add cliffs to the back of the hills, but to save time, I'm only going to be detailing the areas that we see. We're really not doing anything new at this point. Again, the vast majority of environment creation is just copying and pasting meshes around. And since these meshes are already pretty randomized and natural, there isn't anything too technical about this process. I'm just moving objects around until I think they're in a good position. I think the landscape transitions in between the cliff objects, like right here, and the grass is way too jarring. If we have a character, then he just comes up to this location and then immediately goes from grass to cliff. So not very realistic. We could hide this transition by manually adding in and painting in the cliff material. So I'm going to go around my cliff areas and paint in the cliff layer where our mega scanned assets meet the grass to just give it a more natural transition so it's not as noticeable. Also, as a reminder, when painting a layer, you can hold down Shift to remove that layer. Okay, great. I would say at this point, we are pretty much done to the medium to large details. Now it's time to move on to the medium details, which is our trees and the actual castle environment and castle ruins. So this is going to be pretty fun, but before we make any changes, let's make sure to save our world because we've done a lot of work so far and it'd be a shame if we lost our progress. And let's also make a backup of castle environment. So Control C, Control V, and let's call this one Castle Backup 02. And in case you don't know, to rename assets in Unreal, right click and select rename, or you can press FN2 on the keyboard as a shortcut. So let's make sure that we're editing castle environment and we are up here, or I could double click on it to make sure that I am inside of the level. Now, there are 3 ways that we're going to get assets for this build. So number 1, we're getting assets from Quixel Bridge. Number 2, we got them from the downloadable content that was already created for us. And number 3, we're going to get free assets from the Epic Games Marketplace. So make sure you have the Epic Games launcher pulled up. And the specific product I want is the Megascans Trees. So type that in and it's Megascans Tree European Black. Now currently it's in early access, so there might be some changes in the future. Also in the future, these trees are going to be added to Quixel Bridge, so you don't have to go through the Epic Games launcher in order to get them. But let's go add to project and make sure show all projects is selected because the trees right now aren't created for UE5, so we need to download the UE4 versions. So make sure show all projects is selected to see my Unreal Engine 5 products, and then find our project, which is called Castle Environment, select it, and it says asset not compatible with version 5. That's fine. For the version, select 4.27 and then add to project. Wait for it to download and be added to your project. And we have one more asset pack I want to download from the marketplace because you'll notice that while these trees are great, it doesn't come with pine trees. So type in interactive spruce forest, and it is specifically this one right here. So add to project, show all projects. Let's find castle environment, select that, and then add. We can verify that those assets have been added to our project by opening up the content browser. Now we have a new folder called Black Alder and another new folder called pn_interactive spruce forest. So that tells me everything has successfully been downloaded. Now, just like what we did with our cliffs, I want to drag out all the meshes I'm going to use into my project. So let's come over here and let's first go over how to use the Megascans trees under the Black Alder folder. Jump into geometry, and there are 2 different versions of each tree. You have Pivot Painter, and then you have Simple Win. I recommend we're going with Simple Win since it's a lot more performant. And let's select everything and then drag it out into my world and organize everything so we can see what assets we have available to us. I'm also going to drag out a human reference to get a good sense of how large and tall the trees are. Now let's go over some of the properties of Megascan trees. So you notice that as I zoom in, we get more detail, and as I zoom away, we get less and less detail until it's just a flat plane geometry, very little detail. And that's because of level of detail. Now normally, I would recommend we don't use level of detail. I would recommend we use nanite, but unfortunately, as of this version of Unreal Engine 5, which is the first version, nanite does not support trees and foliage. But if you are watching in the future, then congratulations, nanite probably supports trees. I would go through all of my trees, right click, and then enable nanite. Well, since it doesn't work right now, I'm not going to do that. Now we can view all my level of details by opening up its static mesh editor. And right here for LODs, We have LOD 0, which is the most dense this tree can be. Then we have 1, which is less dense. 3, less. 4, 5, which barely has any leaves. And finally 6, which looks pretty bad up close, but when you're far away, it's kind of hard to tell that's just a flat plane or real geometry. So if you're watching the future, congratulations, you don't have to worry about these LODs if you make your tree nanite. Now, what if you don't care about performance and you want to turn off LODs? Well, you can do so by coming down here into the console commands and typing in r.force LOD, and to select the most dense LOD, type 0. So that will force all the static meshes in your world to use the most dense LOD, which is 0. So even if we're far away, it's still going to use the really dense mesh. But I wouldn't recommend doing so, since if you do have thousands of trees in your world, then your frame rate will dramatically drop. Now, if you want to bring back LODs, in console commands, instead of typing r.force LOD 0 or 1, type in -1 to bring back the default LOD switching, just like that. Also, if you do add your trees in through the foliage mode, then the console command is going to be a little bit different. So r.force LOD doesn't work for meshes painted with the foliage mode. Instead, you want to use foliage.force LOD. So foliage.force LOD is the same thing as r.force LOD, except for foliage meshes. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's go over how we can control the look and the wind speed of our trees. And we can do so by jumping into m_ms presets and going all the way over here to ms_foliage material, go into the folder called global foliage actor and drag this in. So this actor right here and all of its settings control all the Megascans trees. And if I press play right now, we will get a bunch of errors. And that's because there is no directional light set right here. So within the dropdown, you want to select directional light, which is the light we created all the way at the beginning of this chapter. Now, if I press play, we don't get any errors. So right here, within the details panel over global foliage actor, we get a bunch of different options. So right here, we can control wind. If we want to increase the strength, right now it's 2. I can set this to 10. And now our trees are very windy. And you'll probably notice an issue, and that is if I zoom in on the trees, let's say right here, there's a lot of motion blurring going on. And that's a glitch with the current version of UE5. So you might not have this, but if you are using the first version of Unreal Engine 5, to fix this weird motion blurring glitching, select the tree, and then for mobility, set it to movable. And that'll get rid of it, and now we can view our tree like normal. So I'm going to select all the trees and select movable for mobility to get rid of that issue. So that's one glitch you need to be aware of. And then if I select my foliage actor again, go down to season strength, I'm able to control what season our trees are using. And this wind strength is pretty annoying, so I'm going to set it back to 2 as its default. So if I raise season strength, we get more and more orange and yellow until we get a fall color. So I'm going to leave it at a value of 500 or 800 for now. Now we have season brightness and season saturation. I think the color is a little bit too brown. I want it to be really saturated. That's how it feels like we're in a fantasy world. So bring up the brightness and the saturation right there like this until you find a value that you like. And we can always jump back into the foliage actor to make any edits if we don't like the edits we already have. So do keep in mind that we don't edit a material instance, although you can if you want precise controls for your Megascan trees. Instead, you're going to use this foliage actor right here, which is located in MS presets, foliage material, and global foliage actor. So simply drag one out into your world, and that'll control all your trees. All right, so that's how you control Megascan assets. Now let's go over how we control the spruce forest, specifically the pine trees. So pine trees are located in pn_interactive spruce forest. Jump into there and then go into meshes. And we need a filter for static meshes so we can see all the static meshes we have available to ourselves. So I'm going to select all the really large ones at first, but you notice that some of these meshes are duplicated again. So I'm going to hold down Control and select all the large meshes, without underscore low. So select these right here, skip over all those, and then drag it out like this. Unfortunately for us, there's a glitch on some of these meshes level of details. We'll see that when I zoom out, there's a completely different material on their level of details. So that is wrong. Now the way we fix this is to entirely delete that level of detail. So I'm going to select this mesh right here, and I could press Ctrl B, double click on it to open up the static mesh editor, or press Ctrl and E as a shortcut. So let's go through all my LODs. LOD 0 looks good. LOD 1, good. 2, good. 3, and we are completely using the wrong material. So I'm going to remove LOD 3 from its LOD stack by making sure LOD 3 is selected right here. And under LOD 3, select remove, just like that. So now all we have is 0, 1, 2, and 3, and we don't get that wrong one. So let's do the same thing right here, press Ctrl and E, and this one's also LOD 3, and then select remove LOD. Now what I'm doing is going through the rest of the meshes and making sure they don't have that issue. In the future, we probably won't have these issues since Nanite will support foliage. So if you are watching in the future, congratulations, you don't have to go through this process. You just have to enable Nanite on the pine trees. All right, one more change. If you come up to any foliage with wind, you'll see that there is a lot of motion blurring. Of course, that's the same glitch that we have with the black alder trees. So select all of them and set it to movable. Now, there's one last change, and that is I want to change the color of my bark. Since my bark is pretty white, I'd rather have that be reddish brownish. So what I can do is open up the bark material instance to change it. And we can see that this mesh has a lot of different materials, and one of them is the trunk material. Now, if you don't know which one is the trunk material, you can always open up a static mesh, and right here in material slots, select highlight to know exactly what material is affecting what part of the static mesh. And we'll see that the material called trunk is of course in charge of the trunk material. So let's open up that material instance that I have open right here and undock the details panel so we can play with the colors. So for all the way down here, we have bark tint. Let's change it. So that's how it's more brown. I like that color, so I'm going to keep it. And we can even make some changes all the way up here under bark parameters. Bring this down, so that's how my trunk is a little bit darker to 0.5. I can also play with the wind. So let's say if I don't like how my bark is swaying back and forth, if I come up here, it's more noticeable. You can see how it's going back and forth. Then I can uncheck level 1 wind, 2 wind, and 3 wind. But then you'll notice that the rest of the tree is disconnected since it's still relying on the wind. Now I can fix that by jumping into the leaves here, or the branches, and you'll see that the branch parameters are the exact same as the trunk since they're all sharing the same exact master material. So go through here and uncheck level 1 wind, 2 wind, and 3 wind to get rid of wind. And I would do the same thing for the leaves, but I do like the wind, so I'm going to bring them all back. I'm just using that as an example where if you don't want the wind, you have to remove them from all the materials. So you make sure that you do uncheck them if you are trying to get rid of wind. And I'm going to do the same thing right here. So open up this materials trunk instance and bring down brightness to 0.5 and give bark tint a reddish, dark reddish tint like that. Now I'm going to do the same process of changing the color for the rest of the trees with exposed trunks. Don't forget to save everything. Now that we have all our trees set up, let's add them to the foliage mode. So to begin, I'm going to start with the pine trees. So let's go select all of these with Shift, press Ctrl B to find out where they are in the content browser. And with those selected, I can drag them right here into the foliage editing mode. So now I can paint them on my landscape, but obviously we're going to have an issue since we paint way too many trees. Obviously we don't want our trees being that dense. So we need to edit a lot of the settings of the foliage. And keep in mind, if you don't see any parameters right here, make sure this button is turned on, so it's blue. Now, for density, bring this from 100 down to 1. Also, paint density up to 1. So let's see what that looks like. And that is still way too strong. So try 0.25. And okay, we're getting closer, but that's also still too many trees. I don't want that many trees. So 0.01. Okay, there we go. So that looks like it's good. But you'll see that my trees angle to the slope of the landscape. And obviously trees don't grow like this. Even if a tree is on a steep slope, it's going to grow straight up. So within these settings right here, and actually I'm going to increase this to 0.05. Within the settings, align to normal, make sure that's unchecked. So now my trees will always grow straight up. They won't be dependent on the slope of the landscape. Another thing I need to do is that if I zoom in on the wind, we still get that little motion blurring glitch. So with all of these selected, set its mobility to movable to get rid of that. Okay, and I also want to make sure that our size is correct. So let me add in a character, go into mannequins, meshes, and drag out skm_Manny to compare the size differences. So I think the trees with their bark exposed are too big. So select these trees right here. And for scale X, bring it down to, let's go 0.7 to 0.8. So now all these trees I have selected will be scaled to 70% to 80% their original size. Okay, that's starting to feel a lot better. And for these really tall trees, I want there to be less of them than the thick ones. So this density will be 0.01, while the thick trees have the density of 0.05. Great. So now we're going to add some new trees, the black alder ones, to our foliage mode. So I'm going to select all the black alder trees that I want. We're handling the medium detail, so I'm going to ignore the really small trees for now. We are going to add them after we handle the really big trees. So select all the big ones, press Ctrl B to find out where they are in my content browser, and jump back into foliage mode with Shift and 3 and drag them all in there. Now I only want to focus on our Megascan trees, so hold down Shift and select all of our pine trees and uncheck them so we don't paint them. Now we're going to start off with the same exact issue that we had beforehand, and that is painted down. And okay, hopefully Unreal doesn't crash because I just added in a lot of trees right there. So bring these trees down to a density of 0.01. Okay, that's better. And we also have that angle problem. So go into align to normal, uncheck that. And we have motion blurring once again. So with all those trees selected, sets mobility to movable. And that will get rid of it. So now we can hold down Shift. And this feels a lot better. So let's see what my paint looks like when I have everything. So press Ctrl and A to select all and make sure they're all checked. So when I'm painting, I paint both versions of the trees. I'm testing my paint settings to see if we need to make any last changes. I think I could bring down the amount of thick trees from 0.05 to 0.02. And again, there is no rhyme or reason to these values that I'm setting. These are just settings that I think look nice. So it's entirely up to you, since this is your world, whether or not you want a lot of trees or not that many trees. And because we're using a level of detail, really performance isn't really concerned with painting down a lot of trees, especially in the future once we have nanite trees. So those selected. Also, let's do 0.005. So even smaller than beforehand. And uncheck all these. Just have these checked. And I think these really tall trees are way too tall. So let's see which one is the really tall one. Okay, these two trees right here. So select both of them. And for scale, bring that down to 0.6 to 0.7. So 60% to 70% their original height. And now I think that's a lot more reasonable, especially when we compare it and we can't see the characters. So let's go select all the foliage and remove it, especially when we compare the height to the mannequin. Those trees are really, really tall. So let's go increase the brush size, get rid of all that foliage, and paint foliage again to see. And okay, I think at this point, it's a good base to go through my landscape and start painting in foliage. This portion of the environment build is pretty fun. Just hold down left mouse button and paint in trees where I want to place them. And okay, one last change we need to make. The orange trees, the black alders, are too big, in my opinion, compared to the pine trees. So hold down shift, erase all those. Let's select these black alders right here, the first three, and bring down the size to 0.6 to 0.72 or 0.75. And okay, in my opinion, that looks a lot better, especially if we compare the height to the mannequin. So I think that is pretty reasonable size for trees. Now let's go through with the paintbrush and start to paint in my trees. So you could use the paintbrush, or if you want to get very specific, I can use the single button right there, single instance mode. Instead of selecting all selected, choose cycle through selected. Now, wherever I press, it's going to pick a random tree to place there. If I want to get very specific with my tree placements. So that's another option, or I can stick with paint. So let's decrease our brush size and add the trees right here. And this is a reminder, just because we paint our foliage with the foliage mode doesn't mean we're limited to changing the exact position of a mesh. So I can use select mode and make sure that whatever mesh I want selected has a check mark right next to its icon, and select a tree, move it around, scale it, and rotate it as if it's a normal mesh. So we get a lot of control over our foliage. And paint down trees, especially on spots that are noticeable, like the tops of hills. And if I ever don't like the placement of a very specific tree, I could use the select mode and move that tree around, or if I don't like it, completely delete it. Now I'm going to repeat that exact same process for the rest of my landscape. So I first use the paintbrush to paint in a bunch of trees, or I use the single brush if I do want precise placement for each of my trees. And then I go through again with the select tool to move, scale, and rotate my trees around until I get perfect positioning. It is that simple. And here's a tip in case I do want to see what my world will look like without level of detail. Since if you do decide to render out this world as animation, then it's going to use the most dense level of detail possible. Select the console command, and once again, type in foliage.force LOD and 0. Now keep in mind that your frame rate will exponentially drop because now we are using the densest mesh possible. So we no longer have LODs, which makes our world look a lot nicer, but now our frame rate is about 5 to 10. Again, in the future, you won't have this issue. Your trees will look really nice with the most detail possible since they'll be nanites. But for now, this is our limitations. As a reminder, to re-enable level of detail, go right here and type in foliage.force LOD and -1 to re-enable level of detail for smooth frame rates. So I want to point that out because in case if you want a really nice shot and you don't care about FPS, then you can set your foliage to 0 that way. I think the placement of my trees are pretty good, so we're going to take a quick break from painting trees. And there's one change that's not really related to foliage I do want to add, and that is to increase the saturation and contrast in my world to make my trees feel more lively. So I need to select the post-process volume over here. And let's go see what our main shot looks like by jumping to our bookmark with 1. Go into global, saturation, and contrast. For contrast, change this to 1.02. Let's try 1.05. Turn it on and off to see what difference it makes. Okay, that makes it look better. And then for saturation, increase this to... Also, let's try 1.05. Let's see what our world looks like without LOD. So use foliage.force LD 0. And in case you want to use a console command that you used in the past, you can use the arrow keys on the keyboard to use previously used console commands. So select force LD 0. And okay, everything is starting to look pretty nice. So bring back level detail with -1. Also, let's jump back into foliage, move this off to the side, and continue to paint in more trees, especially on the tops of the hills. Since any trees that are in between hills, these trees won't really be noticed. So it's important that we add trees at the very top of the hills where the player can actually see something. Since I want the play space to be this area right here, and our main cinematic shot is this angle. So I'm going to prioritize for time the area around the lake for extra detail. This is just what I'm doing. If you're doing a completely different shot, or if you want your entire world to be playable, then of course you'll add more trees that way. Then of course, where you're going to paint trees and add details will be different. Right now I'm using the select tool and moving the trees around. I especially want to move this tree that's on top of the river. I notice that we have the world grid right here. I don't like seeing the world grid. I don't need it. So go to show and uncheck its show flag to get rid of it. Also, using the foliage select tool, I can hold down Alt to duplicate foliage. The only thing I'm doing is painting foliage, specifically the trees, and moving them around. There is nothing special or anything too technical about this process. And it's almost entirely artistic. The majority of environment builds in Unreal Engine is literally just moving objects around until you find something that you think looks nice. At this point, to get a better sense of how the world will feel like in game, I think it's a good idea to play the game. I could play my game with Alt and P as a shortcut and explore my world as a third-person character. As a reminder, if you play your game and you don't get the player character, that's because you need to go into world settings. If you don't have world settings, come up to Windows and select world settings. And then under game mode override, make sure you select BP_ third-person game mode. Now, third-person game mode is right now the default game mode because we did start off our project as a third-person template. Now, if you don't have the third-person character, then you can always go to add feature or content packs, and select third-person right there. So that's just a reminder if you aren't getting the third-person character as our default game mode. Also, if you see in the top left-hand corner this red warning that says texture streaming pool over budget, then you can fix that by exiting out the game, coming down here into console commands, and then typing r.streaming.pool size, and then set it to a large number like 10,000. So now if I play my game, we no longer get that warning. So whenever you do see that warning, go into the console commands and then change the pool size to something large. I tend to just go with 10,000. Okay, I need to fix these trees right here, but I do like the scale of the environment so far. So let me fix these by selecting both of them and bringing them down. Also, I need to flatten out this area just a little bit within the landscape sculpting mode, and then paint mud right here because it looks like we don't have a good transition between the grass and water. So go to smooth for sculpt, increase the brush and smooth all of this out. Also go into paint now and add in the little mud right there. Just like that. Another thing I'm going to do, use layer D, which is our dirt material, and create a trail. So it's almost like there's a trail going in between this little valley around like this, all the way into the horizon. So that's what I'm going to do. Let's paint in a trail and grab the character to see the scale of it. I'm painting the trail right now, trying to make sure it's the right size relative to our player character. And then I'm going to have to move the trees out of the way. And then I notice that the little valley is a little bit too small. So I'm going to use a sculpt brush and make the valley even bigger. Just because we're done with large details doesn't mean I'm done sculpting the landscape. there can always be small improvements or entirely new details I can add. All right, so our environment is starting to come along really nicely. As a reminder, I can click on FN10 to get a full screen view of my world with all my windows now docked right here. So while my environment looks nice, it is missing one big focal point, arguably the most important part of the environment, since it's where our eyes will be drawn to, and that is the castle. So we're going to create a castle right here on top of this hill. And we're also going to add castle ruins over here too, to just add some more interesting visual elements to our world. And we can see all the assets we're going to use to create our castle within the castle asset pack that we downloaded. Go into maps and then select overview. So here are all the assets we're going to put together to make the castle. And as you could probably guess right now by just looking at all the pieces, our castle isn't one large single mesh. Instead, it's a bunch of different smaller meshes that we put together to make a larger object as a whole. So you can essentially think of all these different pieces as Lego blocks, and we're going to stick all the Lego blocks together to create an entire Lego set. And this is actually a very common workflow in Unreal Engine 5. It's called modular design. So for example, we can take all of these different pieces and put them together to create many different castle variations that we can see in example castles. So here are just some ideas that you can pick from when creating your castles. While all these castles are extremely different from each other, they are all using the same exact assets thanks to modular design. We can see that if I click on this castle, that they're made up of the same objects, just positioned differently. And that's the power of modular design. It's going to give you, the viewer, the ability to create your own castle completely from scratch. So I wouldn't recommend that you follow one of these blueprints exactly how it is. Try and experiment and create your own castle when you are building it out. Or, and then this is an option, you could completely just steal one of the castles already built for you. So if we go into the outliner tab, and actually let's right click and select undock from sidebar, scroll up, we can see that each of these different castles are contained within their own folder. So right here is our main castle, then castle ruins is right here, small castle is all the way over here, and tower castle is this one. So let's say, for example, if I want the main castle, I can right click on the folder and then go to select and check immediate children. It's going to select all the static meshes that makes up the main castle. We can even double check that this is the main castle by turning on and off the eye icon. With all those static meshes selected, press Ctrl and C, and then jump into our main environment under Maps, Castle Environment, Save Selected. And right here, Ctrl V to paste the castle into our main environment right here. Now we can move this into position on top of the hill and simply get it into position like this. So we don't have to create a castle completely from scratch. We could grab one of the pre-built ones, but for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to go through the process of creating an original castle completely from scratch. So I'm going to delete this, and creating a castle is pretty easy. So let's jump into castle assets and meshes, and here are all the meshes we're going to use. So first off, we need the base of our castle. So the front of it, which is a wall, we can use this wall right here. So SM_wall01 is the most simple of assets. It is simply just one tiled wall that we can use. And before we continue building out my castle, we need a human reference to help us with scale. So jump into characters, mannequins, meshes, and we're going to use skm_Manny to make sure our castle does have the correct scale. We also have an alternative to this wall. So press Ctrl and B, and this wall I slightly like better, and that is SM_wall07. So this one right here is basically just the same wall as this one, except it has some extra geometry and stones to make it feel more three-dimensional. So you just place them next to each other like this. Move that one up a little bit. And then select both of them, hold on Alt, duplicate them to move them up. I'm going to delete that one and then copy this. That's how we have wall 07, just like that. So that is basically the process we're going to be doing. So we don't have to be super specific. We're trying to line up our walls, especially since this is a medieval castle and medieval castles are never perfect. It can always be a little bit off-centered, like right here. It doesn't have to be completely perfect. Also, to prevent repetition, I could rotate this 90 degrees. That's how we're using the other side of the wall, and we're not always using the front. So select these three, hold on Alt, and move it up like this. So I'm just building a pretty big wall right now. And if I want a wall with a window, then I could come into here and use SM_wall09. So drag this out, and let's delete that wall. Add this wall right there, and try to rotate it and move it into place. Just like that. Now you will notice that this wall right here has a separate material that's a little bit different. So it does stand out from the rest. We could change that. So select this wall, and actually let me go undock the details panel and the world settings. So with this selected, the details panel, I want to select this material right here. So click on the magnifying glass and then drag this material onto that wall. But if you do want to use the original material of this wall, then you can go into Castle Assets Material and use mi_wall stones blend. So this is an alternative material that you can use to just change the way that it looks. That's why we're not always using the same material. We can add some color variation to the castle. Also, while we're on the subject of materials, if we open up any of these materials, you will see that in the details panel, we have access to albedo tint and albedo control, which function the exact same way that they do with Megascan assets. So these are the same parameters if you do want to change the way it looks like right now. But I'm going to uncheck that since I want to leave the materials as is. Another wall mesh that I like to use, press Ctrl and B to jump to our castle asset meshes, is SM_wall08. So drag that out, and this will be the top of the wall. So place that right there. Duplicate that, move it there. And do keep in mind, in order to move our modular assets around and to make it easier for us, you want to make sure global is unchecked, because then we're moving the asset relative to the world. We can't move the object back and forth or side to side depending on its rotation. We need to click this button up here to get its local rotation. So that will help when using modular assets. Hold down Alt and move that. And put all of these into place just like that. And another wall mesh we can use, I'm going to select this wall mesh and move it back, is these walls right here. So wall 02, 3, and 05, which is good to add destroyed elements to our world. For example, right here, I can add in wall 02 like this. So that's how it looks like. This part of the wall has been destroyed a little bit. So scale that up. And then to cover the top right there, I can use this piece and then move it like this. Just like that. So it's almost like someone took a chunk off of this wall. Maybe the wall fell off, or this fortress was attacked and a cannon hit it. So let's go work on the sides right now, and we can do that with entrance large pillar 05, which is our traditional castle pillar, or 03, which is a similar mesh, but slightly more destroyed. So with this, I can stick this to the side right here, and then I need to extend this down. So I can use SM_entrance large pillar 01, which is just a simple cylinder and a texture. So bring that down like this, and then down again. And as a reminder, if you don't like the material that's currently on this pillar, then we can select mi underscore wallstones03 and replace them right there like this. So another thing we're going to do is let's select any of our meshes, press Ctrl B, and alternative is this one. So SM underscore entrance large pillar 07. So this is a great one to add to the sides and give some thick weight to our fortress right there like that. And below that is SM underscore entrance pillar 02 that we need to add there to extend this piece going down. Right there like this. And let's also make sure that we give the top one right here the same material. So you can see very quickly by using a bunch of modular meshes, we could create a brand new fort that wasn't just provided to us. And this is why I love using modular assets, is because it's literally just like playing with Legos, where we get a bunch of different blocks, and from those blocks we have a near infinite amount of combinations to create whatever we want. So let's also add a flag right here. Go back into meshes, and we have this flag I can add to the side. Also, I have SM underscore flag 02, which will be stuck to the walls. Or we have this insanely large flag that you could put at the front of your castles, let's say right there. But now that is covering that detail. So I'm going to move this off to the side right there so that we can still see our window after we add the flag to the front of the castle. Just like that. I can even add these SM underscore round stones right there like this to the corners of my castle. Before we continue building out my castle, and keep in mind this is completely optional, but we can organize our castle into a folder. So to create a folder, go into your outliner tab, and at the very top right here, right click on castle environment or the name of your level and go create folder. Now I'm going to call this one my castle, or you could call it whatever you want. If you ever want to change the name of a folder, right click, go down to edit, and then select rename. Now to get assets into a folder, you can select any of the assets in the outliner, hold down the left mouse button and drag it into the folder. Or you can hold down shift and select multiple assets and drag those into the folder like that. I'm going to press Ctrl Z since that isn't necessary. Now what I want to do is add all these static meshes to my castle. So go through and select all the static meshes that make up the castle. Just like that. So I'm going to move it around temporarily to make sure that I do have all the assets selected, and I do. So now with all of them selected, I could hold down the left mouse button and then try to drag it up into the folder, but the folder is all the way at the top of the outliner, so it might be a little bit hard. Or within the outliner, I can right click on any of the selected meshes, go to move to, and select my castle to move those assets into that folder. And now all my assets that make up my castle are within this folder. So that's just one option to organize your world. Of course, that is completely optional. The benefits are that you know what assets make up your castle, and also you can hide and unhide the castle as a whole, or you can right click, select immediate children to select all the meshes in that folder. But that is optional. And one last thing I'm going to do before we go into this build, and that is I do really like our world right now. I like the way it looks, where all the trees are placed, the water, and the beginning of this castle. I don't want to lose anything. So of course, we're going to jump into our maps, and let's duplicate this. Call this one right here, Castle Backup 03. Just like that. And let's also save everything so we don't lose our progress. And now let's start to build. For this portion of the tutorial, the video is going to be sped up, because if I didn't time-lapse this portion, then that would add an extra 30 minutes to this video, and this tutorial is already pretty long. Now, we're not introducing any new concepts whatsoever. The only thing I'm doing is adding new objects into my world, moving them around, rotating, scaling, maybe even duplicating, and trying to find combinations of pieces that look good together. If we want to use the Lego analogy again, I'm just putting bricks together to try to create a larger set as a whole. Honestly, it's this portion of the environment build in Unreal Engine that I find to be the most fun, where I don't have to think of anything technical whatsoever. I just have to think of what looks cool in my environment. If there wasn't a time constraint, I can spend hours moving objects around and trying to find new compositions and looks for the castle. Notice how I'm also changing the lighting just a bit to see what my world would look like at different times of the day. Again, and this is a reminder, I highly recommend that you don't mirror or copy every single mesh placement that I'm doing. I recommend that you experiment with all the assets given and you try to create your own asset that's unique to your environment. If there's any portion of this environment build where I would suggest that you do something different from me, it would be right now. Because there's a reason why I chose modular assets for this build, and that's because modular assets allow for an infinite number of customizations, so everyone that follows this tutorial will have a different castle from each other. Right now I'm adding some of the smaller details, like flags and green ivy, because I really like the way that the ivy looks, because it helps blend the castle in with the environment just a little bit more. At this point, I am completely done with my main castle. It looks really nice, it stands out, and it's different from the example castles. Now, hopefully you didn't follow along with me exactly, but you created your own version of this castle that reflects whatever you were trying to go for. Because again, I highly recommend that you create a castle since it's really good practice. Now I'm going to press F and 10. That's so I can see what my world looks like in full screen. And I do want to make some quick edits to my post-process volume. So select it and then go into the details panel. I think it might be a little bit too saturated, so bring this down to 1.01. And for contrast, bring that down to 1.045. So actually 1.04. So very, very small changes. And exposure, it could be a little bit brighter, not like that. Let's try 10.2. Yeah, I'm going to leave it at 10.2 for now. So we still haven't built my castle ruins. So I want to add some ruins of a castle or fortress over to the left side of my view to add some more detail. And I highly recommend that you go through all the assets we just used, maybe even go through Quixel Bridge and find some castle ruin assets there and create your own castle ruins because it's really good practice. Now what I'm going to do is cheat right now and go into castle asset maps, example castles, and steal the castle ruins right here. So go to outliner and select castle ruins, right click, select immediate children, Control C all of these to copy, and then jump into your maps, castle environments, and then Control V to paste it in. So all of them are right here. I'm gonna move it to this location to the left. Now I wouldn't recommend that you do that. Instead, as practice, create your own castle. I just decided to cheat to save time. Now we've handled the really large details, which is our mountains and the landscape. Then we handled the medium details, which is the cliffs, trees, and the castles. And finally, it's on to the super small details, which is our pebbles, rocks, twigs, and shrubs. So where are we going to get these assets? You probably guessed right, and that is within Quixel Bridge. I've already gone ahead and downloaded a lot of the assets I want to use under favorites. So I want to use this tree stump, add to my project, this rock right here, and also this rock. And scroll down, of course we want vegetation. So violet wood, use that. And this is my favorite grass clumps. Add that to your project, ferns, white flowers. And I really like Icelandic terrain. It's one of my favorite meshes in Quixel Bridge. So of course I want to add that. the forest roots, pebbles, and common fern, and some more branches and broken trees. So that's basically all the assets I'm going to use for this tutorial. Of course, there is 14,000 assets within Quixel Bridge. Feel free to find your own meshes that you like and add to your project. But these are the meshes I'm going to use for now. And here we have a bunch of new static meshes in the Megascans folder. So I'm going to start off by placing some of the large assets, like the wood, rocks, and boulders, to help vary up the landscape. Because otherwise it'll just be a flat landscape. I want to add some small height variation to it, since the landscapes in real life are normally never this smooth. It's also never too late to add in new trees and shrubs. Now that we handled the boulders, let's start painting down our foliage. And sometimes when you import assets from Quixel Bridge, they will automatically be added to our foliage. So we didn't have to go where grass clumps are and then select them and drag them in. They were automatically added because Quixel Bridge is smart enough. But we're still missing some assets that I want to use, and that is the small meshes from our interactive spruce forest. So go there into meshes, small, and let's use the last 4 and drag that on like that. Whenever I have new static meshes in the foliage tool, I first do a couple of test paints to make sure that the settings are correct before I paint it like normal. Alright, so now that those are painted, let's start painting our grass. And we'll see that our grass is way too bright. So let's go find where grass is and open up its material instance. So we have this material instance right here. And for color overlay, bring it down to something darker and also decrease its translucency strength to 4. Okay, so there we go. So that is a lot better. Maybe even 5. So we're going to leave it like that. But when I go away, we still transition into the lowest LOD, which looks different. And that's because it's using a different material, which is right here. So this material controls the lowest LOD. We need to make the same changes. So that is bring down its color to something a lot darker. And then bring down translucency to 4. So there we go. So now the transition is much more natural in between the LODs. So let's start painting down our grass. Now I'm only going to paint foliage and detail this specific area that is next to the trail. The reason why is because this is going to be our main playable space. Now, if the player character can walk around our entire map, then I would go through the entire map and detail the landscape and paint foliage. But obviously that would take up a lot of time. And it's the same exact process as what I'm doing right now. Notice how for a lot of the foliage, I'm doing the same exact thing we did for the grass, and that is decrease its color. Because by default, I think Megascan foliage is a little bit too bright. I want to point out that just because we have foliage static meshes like grass, doesn't mean we have to place it through the foliage mode. I can still, like any static mesh, simply drag the grass out from the content browser and place it like normal. And finally at the end right here, I'm adding rocks to the shore and twigs to the path. And as a reminder, for those assets, you can also enable nanites to increase performance. I'm also adding ferns to the top of my cliffs, because it doesn't make sense that there wouldn't be any foliage growing there. Alright, I am almost done with this environment. There's just one last change I want to make, and that is these trees, in my opinion, are way too brown. I want to make them yellow, so since they're Megascan trees, we can control them with the global foliage actor. So select that, and then within the details panel, let's open that up, and increase the season strength and the season brightness to somewhere around 1.5. And saturation, decrease that just a little bit, since I think it was too saturated and it was making the trees more red than yellow. And I want to leave them at yellow. And with that, I'd say we are pretty much done with the environment. So if you have followed along throughout this entire tutorial, pat yourself on the back, since this was a lot of work. Now I can press Alt and P and then run around my world as my character. It is a very satisfying and fun feeling to finally be able to play your environment and world as if it's an actual game. and explore everything you created. Well, I guess now this is the end of the video. I hope you got something out of it, and if you did, make sure to subscribe, because I have a lot more free assets and tutorials planned for this channel. Also, if you did follow along and you create an environment, I would love to see what you made, so make sure to share it in the comment sections below. Now, with all that being said, I guess this is goodbye.